Okay, so let's get right into it. A huge announcement just dropped from the White House about cannabis policy, and honestly, it's stirring up a lot of confusion. So, in this explainer, we're going to break down what this big shift really means, what it doesn't, and why, believe it or not, the real work is just getting started.
So, the first and let's face it, the biggest question on everyone's mind is this one. After all these years, after decades of prohibition, did the federal government finally just legalize marijuana? It seems like a simple question, right? But the answer, well, it's a lot more complicated.
The short answer is a hard no. But wait, don't click away, because what this move actually does is kick off a massive, and I mean massive, test of governance in America. And that is where the real story begins. To really get what's happening, we first have to wrap our heads around the basic problem the federal government is trying to solve here. You could call it the Great Cannabis Contradiction. You see, for years, America has basically been living with two completely different realities when it comes to cannabis. On one side, you've got the states. In most of the country, legal cannabis markets are just a normal part of the economy now. But on the other side, you have federal law, which has treated cannabis like it's one of the most dangerous drugs out there, right up there with heroin. This clash has created just enormous, messy problems for years, especially for things like banking, research, and just basic legal clarity. So, to try and fix this contradiction, the White House issued an executive order on December 18th, 2025. This order is what started the process of moving cannabis from Schedule I down to Schedule III of the Controlled Substances Act. So let's take a look at what that actually means. The keywords here are currently accepted medical use and moderate to low potential for dependence. By moving cannabis to Schedule III, the federal government is essentially admitting, based on the evidence, that it has real medical value and isn't as dangerous as they've classified it for 50 years. That is a huge, huge philosophical shift. And this quote right here, it just nails the nuance of the situation. This isn't about flipping a switch and making everything legal overnight. It's a signal. It's the federal government finally, formally acknowledging that the reality on the ground has changed and that its old policies just don't fit anymore. Okay, so while this move is definitely a big deal, it is absolutely critical to understand its limits. This is where most of the confusion is, and it all comes down to the difference between a simple administrative change and a brand new law. And this is probably the most important point to remember. The president told federal agencies to change a category. That is an administrative action. It is not, and I repeat, not, the same thing as Congress passing a comprehensive law to legalize and regulate cannabis across the country. That's a massive distinction. And because it's not a new law, a whole laundry list of major problems is completely untouched. First off, federal criminal penalties, still on the books. Cannabis businesses, for the most part, still locked out of normal banking. They're still facing a crippling tax burden that no other industry has to deal with. And this move doesn't even begin to solve thorny issues like workplace drug testing or the absolute regulatory mess that surrounds hemp and CBD products. So this brings us to the real heart of the matter. This rescheduling announcement isn't the final chapter. It's the start of a huge test of our institution's ability to actually govern. It's about moving beyond just politics and into the nitty-gritty of policy implementation. You know, at the end of the day, cannabis policy doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's deeply connected to other huge areas of our society. For public health, the challenge is now to actually fund the research that rescheduling allows for. For criminal justice, it's about actively repairing the damage from decades of unequal enforcement. And for the economy, well, the ball is now squarely in Congress's court. They're the ones who have to pass actual laws to fix the banking and tax problems. And administrative change just can't do that. And look, we absolutely cannot talk about good governance without talking about equity. This isn't just a buzzword. It's a structural necessity for any of this new policy to actually work and be seen as legitimate in the long run. Let's be really clear about the history here. The war on drugs was not applied equally. For decades, it absolutely devastated many Black and brown communities. That history has created a deep, deep mistrust in the very same government institutions that are now supposed to create a fair legal market. You simply can't build a stable system on a foundation of mistrust. So what does real structural equity actually look like in practice? It's not just about symbolic gestures. First, it means access to capital. funding for the legacy operators who were in the market before it was legal, and for others from impacted communities. Second, it means real, practical help to navigate the incredibly complex rules. Third, it demands fair licensing that doesn't just hand the whole industry over to big corporations. And finally, it means creating clear pathways for reinvestment so the economic benefits actually flow back into those communities that were harmed the most. This quote really just captures the whole takeaway perfectly. The real significance of this federal move isn't that it solved the problem. It's significant because it basically threw a giant spotlight on all the gaps that still exist. The gap between federal and state law, and the even bigger gap between what a president can do with an order versus what only an act of Congress can achieve.
So we end up right back where we started. This isn't really a story about legalization anymore. It's a story about whether our institutions are up to the job. The federal government has signaled a change, but the real question left for all of us to think about is this. After all these years of debate, are our institutions finally ready to govern this complex issue responsibly and equitably? That's the real test.